The insult hung in the air like smoke. The man in the gray suit had just finished laughing when Daniel finally spoke. Calmly, too calmly for someone holding back years of swallowed humiliation. "I fed you when you were hungry," he said, his voice neither loud nor shaky, just steady. "So, you don't remember me, do you?" Everything in the restaurant froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks hovered in the air. Even the soft jazz humming through the speakers seemed to dim. The man in the gray suit blinked, confused, a smirk already carving itself onto his lips. "What should I remember?" he scoffed, leaning back in his chair as his friends chuckled. Daniel stood perfectly still, tray trembling just slightly in his hands. The smell of expensive steak and aged wine floated around him, but all he could taste was bitterness. Bitter like years of keeping quiet. Bitter like the memory of nights where he didn't have anything to eat. He had served men like this for years, loud mouths who snapped their fingers at him, tipped spare change, and treated him like he was invisible. But tonight something inside him felt different. Not angry, not afraid, awake. 5 minutes earlier, they had mocked him openly, called him boy, snapped their fingers like he was a dog. One of them had tossed a napkin on the floor, laughing as Daniel bent to pick it up. The laughter still rang in his ears. But when he straightened himself and spoke those unexpected words, the room changed. His eyes no longer reflected exhaustion. They reflected truth. "You used to come to St. Mary's shelter," Daniel said quietly. 12 years ago. You were hungry. I was the one who gave you food that night." The smirk on the man's face crumbled. His friends went still. A single glass clinked softly onto a plate, the only sound in the entire restaurant. Daniel hadn't planned to speak. The words rushed out like a dam cracking. Behind his calm tone lay years of loss, hunger, nights sleeping on benches, and days spent helping others because he remembered what it felt like to have nothing. Maria, the waitress working beside him, froze mid-step. She had known Daniel for 3 years and had never seen him look so alive. There was a weight in his voice that made even the proudest hearts tremble. And this, the silence, the truth, the confrontation, was where everything began. A night that would change every life in the room. For several seconds, no one spoke. The restaurant, once alive with noise and laughter, now felt suspended in time. People stared, whispering softly behind menus, wondering who this quiet waiter really was. The man in the gray suit, John, stared at Daniel, his jaw hanging open. His friends exchanged nervous glances, pretending to check their phones, but unable to tear their eyes from the scene. Daniel stood taller now. The tray in his hand no longer trembled. His confidence wasn't arrogance. It was dignity reclaiming its place. I don't know what you're talking about," John stammered, voice cracking. He looked at Daniel again, searching his face. Daniel took a breath. It was winter. 2013, you had no coat, no shoes. You walked into St. Mary's shelter shaking, said you hadn't eaten in 3 days. I was volunteering in the kitchen. I handed you soup. You cried. A flicker, small but unmistakable, moved across John's face. His friends leaned away slightly, no longer amused. "Wait, John," one of them whispered. "There any truth to that?" John swallowed hard. I don't remember," he murmured, "but he did." Everyone could see he did. He reached for his wine glass, hand trembling. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't want to crush him. He wanted him to remember. "You told me that night," Daniel continued softly, "that you'd never forget the people who helped you. You said when life got better, you'd be kind, too." John looked away, shame spreading across his face like spilled ink. Maria whispered, "Are you okay?" But Daniel only nodded. His heart hurt, but not because he wanted revenge. He wanted understanding. He wanted someone to finally recognize the humanity they tried to strip away. He gathered the empty plates and walked toward the kitchen, but every person in the restaurant watched him go. No one laughed now. Back in the kitchen, noise crashed back into his world. Sizzling pans, clinking dishes, cooks shouting orders. But inside Daniel, the silence remained. Maria grabbed his arm. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "They're just drunk." They'll forget everything by tomorrow. That's the problem, Daniel said, voice low. People like that always forget. He set the tray down, hands still shaking slightly. For years he had eaten his words, letting humiliation roll off him because people told him that's just how customers are. But tonight, the dam had burst. Memories flooded him. His mother's funeral, the park benches he slept on, job applications no one answered, the numb cold of Chicago winters. He remembered standing in line at St. Mary's shelter, shivering, hungry, and lost when Sister Lane had handed him soup and told him, "When you stand again, help someone else stand too." He worked there for 2 years, cleaning floors, washing dishes, cooking meals. There he had met John, the broken version, not the polished corporate version, sitting in a restaurant tonight. Back then, John was a ghost of a man, whispering, "Thank you," through tears as he ate. Daniel remembered the gratitude in his eyes clearly, and he remembered the promise John made. Seeing him mock a waiter, the very person who once fed him, cut deeper than any insult ever had. He stared at himself in the metal reflection above the sink. His face looked tired but strong. "I didn't do it to shame him," he whispered. "I just wanted him to remember." But the night wasn't done with him yet. John sat frozen at his table after Daniel left. His hands shook where they rested on the white linen. His earlier jokes now felt childish, cruel, shallow. Daniel's words echoed. "You were hungry, and I fed you." For the first time in years, John felt small. His friends tried to lighten the mood. "Forget him, man," one muttered. "He's just a waiter." But John couldn't forget. Deep down, he remembered everything. Losing his business, sleeping in his car, walking into that shelter with no hope, no strength, no future. And the young man who handed him soup had been the same waiter. His chest tightened painfully. How did I become this person, he thought. The suits, the money, the restaurants. Success had buried the version of him who once cried over a bowl of soup. Quietly, John stood up. "I'll be right back," he muttered. He walked toward the kitchen doors, ignoring the looks from his table. He pushed the door open. Daniel stood at the sink, scrubbing a plate that was already spotless. "Daniel," John said softly. Daniel turned, surprised. "Yes, sir?" John's voice shook. "I remember. It was me. You fed me that night. I was lost, and you were kind." Daniel stared at him, silent. "I didn't save you," he finally said. "You just needed someone to remind you that you were still human." John nodded, tears gathering. "For the first time in years," he whispered, "I feel human again." John stood in the doorway of the kitchen, framed by the swinging metal door, looking smaller than he ever had in his expensive suit. The sounds of sizzling pans and clattering dishes echoed behind Daniel, but neither man paid attention to them. Daniel turned back to the sink, pretending to scrub, although the plate in his hands was already spotless. He didn't want pity. He didn't want a dramatic apology. He wanted peace. But John wasn't ready to leave. "Daniel," John stepped closer, his voice softer than before. "I owe you an apology, not just for tonight, but for forgetting who I used to be." "It's fine, sir," Daniel said without looking up. "You don't owe me anything. People forget. Life moves fast." But his voice was tired. Too tired. John shook his head. "No, it's not fine." His voice cracked. "You gave me food when I had nothing. You looked at me like I still mattered. And tonight," he swallowed hard, "tonight, I treated you like you were beneath me, like you were nobody." Daniel's hands froze. John continued, tears thickening his voice. "That's not who I want to be." Slowly, Daniel looked up. For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other. Two lives had crossed once in pain, and now again in humiliation and truth. "You know," Daniel said, his voice gentler, "when I worked at that shelter, I thought feeding people was just about soup and sandwiches. But it wasn't. It was about dignity. Everyone deserves to feel seen." John nodded, shame softening into understanding. "You're right," he whispered. "I lost that somewhere along the way." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a card, sleek, white, embossed with gold. He placed it carefully on the counter. "I own a real estate company now." He said quietly, "If you ever want something better, call me. Not charity. Just a man giving another man a chance." Daniel looked at the card. For a moment, it felt like his breath caught, but then he exhaled slowly and shook his head. "Thank you," he said. "Really, but I'm okay where I am. I'm not waiting for a better life, sir. I'm building one." John stared at him with something close to awe. For the first time that night, he smiled, not proudly, but humbly. "Then maybe," he whispered, "I should learn from you." And he walked away, changed. The next morning, warm sunlight spilled across the restaurant floors, painting golden lines across the polished wood. Daniel arrived early, tying his apron like he always did. He didn't expect last night to mean much in the long run. People forget. The world forgets. He had learned that long ago. But something inside his chest felt lighter. Maria wandered in behind him, still sleepy. "You made the whole restaurant freeze last night," she said with a grin. "Never seen anything like it." Daniel chuckled softly. Silence teaches more than shouting ever could. Meanwhile, across the city, John sat in his modern glass office, staring at his reflection in the window. He had barely slept. Daniel's words replayed in his mind again and again. "You just needed someone to remind you that you were still human." Those words cut deeper than any loss or success in his entire career. By noon, he picked up the phone. St. Mary's Shelter. A familiar, warm voice answered. John hesitated. "Do you still take volunteers?" "Always." That weekend, John drove to the shelter, the same one he once entered broken and hopeless. Instead of arriving in a suit, he arrived in jeans and a simple hoodie. For 5 hours, he washed dishes, handed out plates, and listened. He heard stories of loss that sounded painfully familiar. Stories of failing businesses, abandoned families, addiction, mental battles, unemployment. Stories that could have been his own. One man asked, "Why is a guy like you doing this?" John smiled softly. "Because someone once fed me when I was hungry." Back at the restaurant, Daniel didn't know any of this, but something about him felt lighter. He had faced humiliation and walked away with dignity, without shouting, without anger, without lowering himself. He had reminded someone of who they used to be, and that was enough. 2 weeks passed quietly. Life at the Blue Harbor restaurant returned to routine. Clinking glasses, soft jazz, and invisible footsteps moving between tables. Daniel served table after table, calm as ever, though whispers of that night still floated through the staff room like an urban legend. "Think he'll ever come back?" Maria asked while polishing silverware one afternoon. Daniel smiled faintly. "People come and go, Maria, but lessons, they stay." That evening, during the dinner rush, the restaurant glowed with its usual extravagance. Perfume in the air, laughter bouncing against marble walls. Daniel was serving table 12 when the hostess approached him. "Daniel, someone asked for you. Said it's important." Daniel wiped his hands on his apron and turned. Standing at the entrance was John, but not the John from that night. Not the arrogant man in the gray suit. This John wore a simple shirt, a worn jacket, no expensive watch. His posture was softer, shoulders no longer weighed down by pride. Daniel walked toward him. "Good evening, sir." John smiled gently. "No, sir, today. Just John." Daniel nodded. "All right, what brings you back?" John took a deep breath, eyes scanning the restaurant. Not with arrogance, but with humility. "I wanted to thank you." Properly. He reached into his jacket and handed Daniel a small brown envelope. "This isn't charity," he said. "It's a donation, in your name, to St. Mary's Shelter." Daniel paused, heartbeat stuttering. "My name? They told me you used to work there," John said softly. "I thought maybe we could feed a few more hungry souls. Together." Daniel opened the envelope slightly and froze. The check inside was more than he made in a year. "You didn't have to." "I did," John interrupted gently. "You gave me back my humanity. I just want to pass it forward." Silence hung between them. Not heavy, just full. Daniel smiled softly. "Then I guess we're both feeding people again." John laughed quietly. "Yeah, only this time it's not just food. Forgiveness didn't need to be spoken. It lived in the space between them. A month later, Chicago breathed its first hint of winter. Cold air brushing the sidewalks, street lamps glowing earlier, sweaters appearing everywhere. Daniel walked towards St. Mary's shelter, carrying a box of canned food. The sky above glowed orange, fading into purple. Inside, the shelter buzzed with life. Pots boiling, volunteers laughing, children running between tables. Daniel set the box down and leaned against the counter. "You still work too hard," a familiar voice teased. Daniel turned. John stood there, volunteer apron tied clumsily around his waist, handing bread to a man in line. Daniel laughed. "Didn't think you'd stick around." "I told you," John said, handing out another loaf. "I'm learning from you." They worked side by side for hours, Daniel serving soup, John handing out bread, neither speaking much, but both building something larger than words. Around them, the faces of those who had been forgotten shone with gratitude. Later that night, as the crowd thinned, John leaned against the counter and said softly, "You know, that night at the restaurant, I thought you were trying to ruin me, embarrass me, take my pride. But now I see," he exhaled shakily, "you saved it." Daniel smiled, watching a man in the corner eat slowly, savoring every spoonful like it was life itself. "We all fall, John," he said quietly. "The only difference is what we do when someone helps us stand again." Outside, the city lights shimmered across wet sidewalks. Snow threatened in the air. A homeless man stepped through the door, shivering violently. Without hesitation, Daniel handed him a steaming bowl of soup and a warm smile. The man's eyes filled with tears. John watched, silent. "You fed me when I was hungry," he whispered. "Tonight, you fed my soul." Daniel looked at him gently. "That's all any of us can do," he said. "Feed each other when the world forgets." The night fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was holy.